Hello, good morning. Good morning from Salzburg, from Austria, from Europe. Good morning to everywhere around the world. It is lovely that you are all joining us here now for this after conference session for Internet4Trust. Internet4Trust is an initiative from the United Nations Organization for Education, Science and Culture. And it has to do very much with how everyone around the world is impacted with the positive as well as the negative effects of the internet on the information space. What is the information space? It's the way we communicate, the way we are sharing with each other messages, the way we are exchanging our thoughts, feelings, and also how we learn about the world through the way others communicate with us, how professionally communication is developed and also curated, how it is transformed through the digital platforms, the community building platforms, the friends platforms, the messaging services, and so on. And here it comes that the key issue here is what is it, how we can strengthen the good and avoid the bad? How can we make sure that it is benefiting the public good, the societal development, the issues of justice and climate mitigation, and how can we actually stop and also mitigate and possibly prevent people from using the means of communication for hatred, for disinformation, for fake news. It's a great privilege for the World Summit Awards to use its global network with UNESCO to bring this topic further and to develop it further. UNESCO sees it as a process which started already some years ago, many years ago. UNESCO started in the 1960s and 70s to talk about the world media order. Then we talked about the world information order. And now we are talking about the internet order. And here the focus is on Internet4Trust. And it's a process which has gained more and more relevance in various different parts of the world, in Latin America, in North America, in the Asian countries, in Africa, but also in Europe and in Oceania, regarding also the political participation of young people and also the possibilities for young people to do good with this means. UNESCO has organized in Paris 3 days of conferences, day 0, where there were a lot of different kind of workshops by various different kind of partners, and now 2 days of a public conference, which was very unique in terms of being inclusive, being very inspiring, and also taking things forward. We are now on day 4 of this process, of this 4 days of Internet4Trust, as this conference is called. And it is very much a question of how do young people reflect on this kind of process? How do young people see this process? What is their perspective on the issues, but also on how this process is working and how to take this process further? There is an objective, which is the guidelines which UNESCO tries to develop and has already developed. There's a version number 2 now, and then version number 3 in the works. And you're all invited to this kind of consultation. And for this kind of consultation, I'm very happy from UNESCO to welcome Guillaume Canela Godol, who is in charge of this process and who is doing a very admirable job. Guillaume, do you want to join me on this stage? How did you like my introduction as chief of the section Freedom of Expression?
Wow, Peter, I was actually astonished on how well you summarized this thing, and I couldn't have been done better myself. So maybe because I'm so tired of these very 3 intensive days, but I must say very successful. And the measure of success here is really the ability to bring together so many different voices and perspectives to a complex issue. In the press release that UNESCO launched to announce the conference, there was a phrase that I like very much, that is, we don't have simple solutions for complex problems. We need to acknowledge that this is, together with the climate challenge we are facing in the planet, one of the biggest and most difficult issues of the 21st century. How we can make, as you were saying, the digital ecosystem a place of opportunities for the full enjoyment of human rights and democracy, while we are mitigating important risks that we are also facing and eventually prosecuting harms that are unfortunately taking place in this digital ecosystem. So during these last 3 days, we heard people, as you said, from all over the world, from different groups, not only the governments, the companies, civil society organizations, academics, engineers, but also from different ages, different cultural backgrounds. And this is essential because the internet is about all of us. Maybe if we were discussing a completely different issue that has a very niche impact, it was not necessary to engage such a plural lineup of speakers, of participants, but that's not the case of the internet. I mean, this is, in a way or another, even if you are not a user, it's impacting your life, because can be impacting an election process, can be impacting distribution of cultural goods, can be impacting the circulation of information for vital issues like the pandemic, for instance, as we witnessed it in the last 2 or 3 years. So the engagement of these different groups, including the youth, is fundamental. If these groups are not heard when this kind of new policies being made, there is one certainty: we will fail. Because they doing these things by bureaucrats like myself, there is a certainty of failure if we are not good enough in taking the different perspectives, concerns, lessons learned, experiences in dealing with these problems, but also, as you said, with these fantastic opportunities. So I'm two of the young people mobilized by WSA that were physically in the conference. They will be here also in this webinar. I don't want to steal their thunder, but if Ashen allow me, he yesterday did a very interesting question to the audience. It was an audience of, I don't know, 1,000 people, and he asked it, how many people were using TikTok? And among all these, I mean, policymakers, industry representatives, civil society organizations representatives, etc., only 3 raised their hands, which shows that we are not necessarily interacting with some of these platforms that are very much the space young people are discussing, creating art, laughing, enjoying, and also circulating, unfortunately, disinformation and misinformation and hate speech and so on. So to conclude, I just want to emphasize what you said. The consultations UNESCO is coordinating, and the conference was that. The conference was not a talk shop. The conference was a consultation moment to listen how we can improve this document that, luckily, hopefully, can be a point. It's not the only element, but can be an element to improve the overall structure of the digital ecosystem. But those consultations, they are truly open. So the participants of this webinar, don't hesitate. Go to the Internet4Trust website, look in the current version of the guidelines, and comment it. And comment it with your heart. Don't be shy to say, we don't agree with this paragraph. Okay. This should be improved. We are being serious that we are consulting. We are not just offering to you a pre-cooked document and just saying we are consulting, but at the end we already know where we want to land. It's not true. We don't know where we want to land. There is just
Okay.
one, let's say, common ground, and I finish with this. And this one common ground is the human rights international values. If your comment is against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, your comment is not going to be taken by us. But if aside that, we are open to all the ideas. And thank you so much for doing that. I do hope to receive the conclusions of this webinar, and these will be taken into consideration in the next steps of the process. Good luck and enjoy.
I hope you stay in the call now and in this seminar, because what you are saying is very, very important. You are not just a lovable bureaucrat, but you are also a very honest person in terms of the invitation which you issue. And I think that people yesterday, when Arsham was asking them, they did not lie that it's only 3 people. They were honest. And what we have to come to terms with is that it is also a very much a generational issue. And that's the reason why Charlotte Ernst and Arsham Idalaktu are important for us to hear. And that's also why we are talking later on to Gloria and Kingsley. But let me first ask Charlotte and Arsham to come into this call, into this webinar, and join us and tell us their impression and share this in such a way that we are basically learning from them. Who of the 2 of you want to talk? I mean, both of you had to travel from Paris all the way back to Austria. I hope that you arrived. You look, again, young and happy. And who wants to start with your reflections on the process and also on this issue of that you, in terms of your generation, look at things differently?
Well, I'll take the start here, if that's fine. Thank you so much, Peter, for giving us the stage. These last 3 days, they were really intense, with a very steep learning curve regarding content moderation, as well as regulations and policies on digital platforms. And I think there are two key questions that we should be asking. One is, how can the youth be educated in order to be included in discussions regarding policies and regulations, as well as to guarantee a successful career in today's digital world and a life as a citizen? And the second one is, who should be part of regulating digital platforms? Who should be brought into the discussion? Our generation, we grew up in this digital world. We know the platform, we know how the platforms work. We use them every day. They're simply a natural part of our lives. But honestly, before Tuesday, I've never really thought about how the content I get displayed even gets to me, or what the process it has to go through before it gets thrown out on my feed. I've never really had to deal with that topic before, and just accepted the rules and regulations as they were and are. This is where we get to the problem, because we know the platforms better than everybody else. We know how to judge and critically question the information we see. We know how to act against information we don't like, and we know how to stand up for our very strong opinions. But we know all of that. But there's one thing we don't know, which is the background processes and how they affect what we see, as well as how changes in regulations would affect our user behavior and even fundamental mindset on most topics. It's not enough to ask the youth every once in a while what we think, because first, you will never get a good answer, because we're not educated enough to give you an answer. And second, actions speak louder than words. Everybody knows that. By just asking us, you won't get anywhere. You need to actively include us and take action. And those 2 reasons, I think they're very bound together, because in order to be included, we need to be educated first. And without our educational opinions, you will never find a solution on how to regulate platforms to make them safe for future generations. I can't stress this enough, because education on digital platforms needs to be part of the mandatory curriculum at schools all around the world. Regulations and policies need to become more public to us. You know how everybody keeps saying the youth is the future. Yeah, that's true, obviously. But you can't forget that the youth is also the present. So stop procrastinating on including us. We're the present now, and we will be the present in the future. And then there's the second point I mentioned earlier regarding who should be part of regulating digital platforms. And the second question that I believe this is, how do we ensure that the development of new technologies solve problems and not create even more? Artificial intelligence shapes us as humans, our human experience. They're nothing we can just cross out of our lives when we don't like them anymore. The digital world we're living in right now is really just the tip of the iceberg, and we're already facing so many issues. And we eventually have to find a way to live with the platforms we don't like as well. And the only way to do so is by regulating correctly and putting effective policies on them that secure our human rights, even when the platforms start developing destructive characters, such as ChatGPT, spreading misinformation that people start to believe. We all know that artificial intelligence doesn't create its own bias, it reflects our behavior. So how can we inspire positive behaviors? And I think the answer to that is by creating rules and setting limits. Lack of regulation leads to disasters, that's a fact, but lack of inclusion of different perspectives leads to lack of regulation and just becomes an endless cycle. It's not enough to let the legislation decide on regulations and policies. The state itself cannot decide on what information to keep private or when to silence us because we share information they don't like. I believe our framework for how we think about policies has to change so the people who create the technologies don't engage with the legislation and vice versa. And reflecting on that sentence itself, it's impossible to create effective regulations. I think we have to motivate the creators as well to ask themselves questions about their tools and include them as well when it comes to finding regulations and policies. Thank you.
Charlotte, the speed with which you speak makes you actually very qualified to be the next Director General of UNESCO. Because you will talk everybody in the entire UNESCO General Assembly into understanding all the issues at once. Thank you very much. What you have done is giving a very comprehensive view. And you are saying two things, which I think is very important. And it's also important for the type of consultation which WSA wants to bring to UNESCO. On the one hand, you say, we have to learn more, and there is a responsibility on the side of UNESCO and also of the older generation of the regulators to explain themselves to us as young people. Okay. And the second thing you're saying is that in return means that we need to have a say and have also an agency to participate. Okay. Right. And these two things you're bringing out really very eloquently. And I think everybody in your generation can be proud of having a spokeswoman of that articulate and competence as you are.
Thank you.
You are part of a group of people who is also Arsham part of, and this is part of the youth part of community of WSA. Arsham, just what were your reflections? Because you have a different kind of temperature of engagement with things than Charlotte. Please, Arsham.
I mean, so the last 3 days during the UNESCO conference, I have seen a lot of people, experts, share their views on how they are going to approach the regulation of these social media platforms. And I have learned that it is a challenging thing for the organizations and the governments to keep up with the rapid and the fast pace of the technological development. And they can all, there is also, so the internet is just evolving so fast, and it also has an impact on the society at the same time. And especially when it comes to protecting children and youth online, there is a need for taking proactive action and also making it flexible to approach the regulation. So I also learned that there is this physical world that we live in, and we are all citizens in the physical world, and there is also the digital world. We all have a identity in the digital world as digital citizens, and with that there also comes responsibility. The aim is to balance between protecting young people and also protecting their rights at the same time, and also their freedom, while also allowing innovation and progress. So too many guidelines. So these are the guidelines, and these are the innovations and the progress. If there's too many guidelines, it will reduce the innovation and will restrict the innovations and progresses. And the thing is, the one interesting approach that I saw is the development of global guidelines that can be adapted and implemented across different countries and organizations as well. So we need to also take into account that there are local cultural differences and legal differences. It's also like, it's important to involve the different stakeholders, the multi-stakeholder approach to this regulation thing. So there needs to be an approach from the technological companies, the educators, the child protection organizations, and also the young people themselves.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. You are as strong as Charlotte, Arsham. And I must say, I'm really moved by this, how both of you try to give a balanced view, okay? Even though many people, like for instance, Maria Resta state very clearly that we need to be very radical in terms of breaking actually the hold of how this development is taking place, especially regarding disinformation, fake news, and how, as they have said many times over at the conference, that lies spread 6 times faster than facts. Okay, so both of you are already very, let's say, considerate and very smart in terms of balancing. What I thought is, what I learned from you, both of you, and also looking and working with you during the conferences, that we have to, WSA has to, UNESCO has to, much more focus on understanding that there's a difference when you look at different generations. And there's this making this kind of, let's say, generational divide, let's say, pertinent and fruitful for the way we are looking at regulating the Internet4Trust. That is a key thing, and I think we need to explore that more and more and more, and we are just very much at the beginning. Your challenge, what was also interesting in what you're saying, is that in terms of bringing things out to other people has very much to do with the identity you have as a young person. And you were telling, and a lot of people in Paris at the conference, that teachers are actually not very good people because they don't carry the credibility with young people, but young people carry the credibility with young people. And now the issue is how young people can carry credibility with the, let's say, older people in terms of this very process around the world, started with UNESCO. For this, we have 2 people from the WSA Youth Ambassador Network who will join us from Africa. One of them is Gloria Mangi. And Gloria, I understand that you are not in Tanzania, but you are now in Bahrain. Is that true? I can't hear you.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Wonderful.
Yes, I'm in Bahrain at the moment. Yes, you're absolutely right. I am not in Tanzania. I hope to be there this summer, but I'm currently based in Saudi Arabia. Okay. I'm in Bahrain just briefly.
And then we have Kingsley, who is the founder of AfricaOnTheRise.com in Nigeria, in Lagos. Kingsley, can you join us as well? He will join us in a second. Gloria, while we wait for Kingsley, let's continue this conversation which Charlotte and Arsham have started. When you just react to what they said, what's your take on the reflections they have had? Please go ahead, Gloria.
Sure. I thought it was actually very interesting, especially when I was listening to Charlotte talking about the youth engagement and getting the youth involved. And something very key that she said that stood out to me about how they always talk about youth is the future, youth is the future. And you consistently hear that regardless of the company, regardless of the country, they always talk about how the youth is the future. And that creates this gap in terms of including the youth in the current situations that we have right now. So I currently work in the educational sector, and I work with a lot of young people. And you see the innovation and you see the creativity within the youth, but there's a lack and the lack of resources and the lack of access to certain things because of the lack of inclusivity. So when Charlotte said that, that kind of resonated with me because I was like, you know what, she's absolutely right. And that's something that a lot of corporations need to start considering. How can we get youth to be involved now? How can we change policies and regulations to include youth, and how can they be part of that conversation? So not just a whole other generation deciding what is good for the young people, which has been a case for a very long time. But how can we bring the youth to and within these conversations? How can we educate them so that they're knowledgeable in terms of how they can respond, how they can ask the right questions, how they can use the resources that they have now with the resources that supposedly governments have to create these access and bridge the gap that is the current situation.
Would you go so far as to say that the statement "youth are the future" is actually a way of trying to push you aside and not let you participate now? Is that
Yes,
what you said?
I agree. I completely agree with like that statement. Kind of hits it on the.
I hate also the patriarchal nature of this. You know, this kind of this condescending thing of saying you are the future, but you are here now,
Right.
and it's the
Exactly.
point. Yeah. Okay. Very good.
Exactly.
I love it. Yes, very good. So what we need to do is we need to have a coalition between you, Gloria, and Charlotte, and Aksha on this point, because this is very much the WSA point, is to say it's not who you are in terms of age. It's that you are here and you have, as Aksha said, an identity as a citizen, and you need to have your perspective heard. Kingsley, this is a challenge also for the most populous country in Africa. I know that I think it's 50% of people, friends, colleagues, your relatives in Nigeria are 50% are under 20, I think 4, and so it's 25. So it's it's a very different kind of world you're living in. How do you react to what Charlotte and Arsham have said?
Yeah, I mean, I think, thank you very much, Peter and WSA for this opportunity. I think that they're very much on point. I think that what they've said is very, very relevant to Nigeria as well as the African continent. I think that what we find to a larger proportion is that a lot of young people who really are the ones who understand this technology, who are the ones who use this technology, and who are the ones who are driving the innovations around that sector, are pretty much left out from the key decision-making process. You know, so for example, when the Twitter ban happened in Nigeria, that was done without wide consultation with the demographic that impacted the most. A lot of young people have built businesses off that platform. A lot of people use that platform for their, daily business, a daily livelihood. And then there's not, so for example, if you have a country where your Minister for Communications or ICT is, in his 50s, going to his 60s, he's not pretty much going to understand how some of these regulations would impact the young people in the community and really just what that does for the economy, So it's very key, it's very important that representation is advocated for emphatically, to be very honest, and sooner rather than later, because what Gloria just said, is very, very apt. We've been hearing we are the future since we were kids, and now we're, we're no longer kids and we're still hearing we are the future. So when is it going to be our future? Because I mean, we're in the election season, and then, we've been advocating for young people to go into government and politics and all that. But you go there and then you're still told the same thing, it's not your turn, you are the future. And then, when that future comes, you're also, you're old at that point, pretty much, in all honesty. So I think it's key. We need to push for that. Then also speaking to what Ashram said, which is also very, very key, so that we do not, there has to be a balance, you know, whilst you don't want to stifle innovation, you also want to make sure that accountability and transparency is also emphasized, you know, because you want to make sure that whatever it is you're building is not destructive in its attempt to be, you know, forward thinking. So there has to be, and that's also something that cuts across not just Nigeria or Africa, it's, you know, the world over. You know, every other day, the big four, Facebook and co, are in one issue with security and data and how they're really managing that, you know, user data and all that. So we need to also advocate for transparency, accountability, but we're also really going to be able to achieve that when we have more young people in the decision-making process. You know, so if you have young people who are able to check other young people, you can't have someone who doesn't understand what this technology does and what it's about, being able to properly checkmate someone who's doing, you know, who is innovating in that space without, you know, without it, you know, not being in the right direction. So they make very, very good points. And I definitely am open to ideas or collaborations that would advance, you know, all of this, you know, on this part.
Thank you very much, Kingsley, for this. What I hear, and this is something which is a very, very important realization on UNESCO's terms, on the global discourse on this issue, especially when it comes to social media. And we will see in a short while a video of a conversation which took place in the US at University of South Carolina, also in preparation of this Internet4Trust conference. But what you have put in is something which I think is very much an additional factor. What you said is they use the platform for their daily lives, also for doing, I mean, to earn their livelihood, okay? So it is not just that it's a freak thing, it's not just that it's an entertainment thing, but it is a survival thing. And we need to see in which way these platforms are forming actually, you know, very much the basis for this, material, sustenance of persons, of families, of entire, you know, communities and so on. So that, I think this is something which is an additional aspect. And I can tell you that I have not heard that aspect very clearly or loudly in Paris at the conference. The second thing which you say is very important for UNESCO. To hear from you, who were not at this conference, who is not directly involved in this, to talk about the importance of accountability and transparency is not just heartwarming, but it means that there is a resonance of these issues, which are actually in the forefront of the motivation of UNESCO to get involved. Because UNESCO is not getting involved in because they want to meddle with the people's lives, or they want to stop, you know, big tech for something, or take away the profits, but they want to really get involved in because of the lack of accountability and the lack of transparency and the impact this has in terms of manipulation of free speech and how free speech is actually used against free speech. And that is something, you know, which is really, something very important. And the last thing, which I think is very much important for all four of you, Kingsley, Gloria, Charlotte, and Arsha, is we need to find, you need to find, we all together have to find a way of talking about these issues so that they can be understood, intelligibly understood, in a way by young people that we speak in their language. Okay, so when I made my intro, I didn't use any kind of technical language, okay? But I tried to speak in the ways, you know, where we share common ground, okay? And what is really interesting in terms of what Guillermo said is that UNESCO is asking for this because they know if we're just having government discourse, if we just have regulatory discourse, if we just have bureaucratic discourse, we will not reach something which is part of the objective of guidelines. Guidelines are something which guide you in the way you do things. They are not legislative norms yet, and they are not sanctioned by, let's say, courts and also by police and so on. So that's something very important. Do I understand the two of you right in making these points? And Gloria and Kingsley, you want to comment on what I said?
I think you kind of summarized it quite well, Professor. There's something else I wanted to add in regards to just access to information, including the youth. When you look at places like in Africa, I'm from Tanzania, and I compare that to Saudi Arabia. So in Saudi Arabia, everything is digital, everything is automated. The youth have access to all these different devices. They have access to a lot of information. It's at their fingertips. The internet is easily accessible, and it's accessible at a reasonable price, right? When you go now to places like Tanzania, where the vast majority of businesses in Africa are small and informal, they face a lot of common barriers. So for example, they don't have access to finance and financial services, or they have poor access to markets, poor access to information, insufficient business resourcing. And though the predominant way that the youth stay connected is through the cell phone, it's very rare in Tanzania. We just see in majority of places, especially the rural areas, somebody with a laptop, somebody with an iPad, though that's very common in the West, it's common in the Middle East. But that being said, the vast majority of users in Tanzania are the youth. So with that type of knowledge and with that type of power that the youth hold, they're quite unaware of how much influence that they are having on the market, how they're using, especially since the pandemic, how they've been using online resources, online platforms to cultivate their businesses, to grow their businesses, to access other parts of the world that they never had access before. And this causes, I guess, a fear within government, because now they're like, how do we regulate this? How do we control this? Or how do we stop this? Because what if it gets out of control? And I've been seeing that a lot in Tanzania. The government trying to control the usage of social media. They passed an act where before we never had that. Like there was never, you could write what you wanted about or discuss what you wanted about the government, how you felt about the different policies. Now you have to be very careful about what you say and how you say it and where you say it within online, or you can find yourself arrested, fined. And the wording around that is not even very clear, meaning that they could say, well, you said X, Y, it falls within this. But when you read that, it's not what's the word I'm looking for? It's not concise. It's not definitive. So there's this cloud of confusion that the youth have, where they're like, we want to be involved. We want to communicate our ideas. We know that there's access to resource, but how do we work together in a collaborative way with the government, with organizations, without feeling like we're being stifled, without feeling like we really don't have a voice unless that voice agrees with what the government, with what certain societies or groups say? I don't know if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense, because this is a very, let's say, similar but very different articulation of what Charlotte said. She said very much, there's this kind of cloud and there's a complexity of issues and you need to understand it. But what you put in is two new issues here. One is the issue of the digital divide in terms of access, which is very much also an economic divide, a technology divide, and also an infrastructure divide. And the additional issue which you put in is this kind of contradictory nature, which UNESCO and is very much aware of, which is that you have on the one hand the demand for the state to protect and to make sure no harm is done, but on the other hand, the state is using it for surveillance and manipulation and also restrictions. And we have to be very, very careful that the guidelines are not moving in that direction and supporting this. Kingsley, do you still want to comment on what I summarized before and the conversation before we move on to the video which we have from South Carolina? Please, Kingsley.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that you did a very fantastic job of summarizing everything. And what Gloria also just mentioned and what you've also elaborated on is also very key. I think that, when people ask me, I think we are in a time and age where, lots of things are consequential. So for example, what we're seeing, proliferation of digital media and digital technology across the world, especially in Africa, where, there's just that whole economic imbalance, right? People are adapting, so young people they have to, they really don't have a choice. If you're blocking me, from accessing different things that I need to survive, I'm going to find a way around it, and so if you don't put young people in the rooms that they need to be in, they will continue to find other ways to access the things that they need. So for example, in Asia, China, I think, right, where people are finding ways to communicate with emojis as against using text so that the government can't really detect what they're communicating or what they're passing across. So it's very key. That's what I'm saying. You need to put, because at the end of the day, if you are not of that, consciousness, that demography, that, age group, you will not really be able to regulate effectively, because you're just going to go around your head and, come up with new ways of, doing these things. And, lots of times you really will not be, by the time you want to start policing it, it's probably too late, So I think you did a very great job of elaborating or summarizing what we spoke about. Yeah. Thank you.
I think what moves me quite strongly is the need to allow people, when they grow up, to have the space for resistance, the space for objection, the space of not having to follow the let's say the proper path, and that we are not using technology to basically provide a straitjacket for everyone, when they grow up and they need to still have to, grow their wings and find out, how life is, I mean, and there's certain kind of freedoms, which we need to, see, and there's no way that you can guard that. You have to just to basically suffer it and allow it, and that's the reason why transgression of rules is also something very important when you grow up, in order to learn about the rules. If you agree, then we move on and listen to how young people in the US view this. And what is really interesting about this very short tape from the University of South Carolina is that the people who put together the conversation there had basically two ideas. One is that young people are not just using social media, but they live social media. They live within it. And that's very much also what you were saying, Kingsley and Gloria. And the other thing is that they have looked at also something which is quite interesting in terms of how it plays out, in various different parts of Africa and other parts of the world, how influencers are basically looking at it and how influencers want to do their business. Can we ask the technology friends here in our call to play the video which we have from the University of South Carolina, please?
Hey everybody, I am Kenneth Moten. We're going to talk about the power of social media and the lives of young people, Generation Z.
There's definitely a lot of phone usage at my school. You'll go to lunch and you'll see kids just sitting on their phone and they won't communicate. And I think a lot of people have lost their ability to communicate because of the phones and social media.
When I was younger, my mom didn't allow me to have social media, and I can say back then I had way better mental health. My self-esteem was better. The difference now with having it, yes, it does, foster connection and community, but people do anything to stand out, and that includes lying and, doing clickbait.
I think at a certain level, social media can be a really great way to be authentic. But I do think when you rise to a certain level of popularity and have that much attention on you, I think that's when a lot of people tend to curate their content more so to appeal to what their fans want and also the image that they wish to convey. And I think it's very easy very quickly to get away from the authentic content that you started with.
I definitely do start to question things I see because it's very easy to edit and skew the way people will view content. And I don't trust social media all the way. Everything can be staged. because it's just a camera and you can control it.
We wanted to ask the children, like, what do they want to be when they grow up? They want to be a YouTuber. And nowadays, the young people want to be like influencers. Like, it's a way to live. And it's a way to contact with everybody, and I can win money.
What is an influencer and why do kids want to be one? It's because we haven't made other jobs look all that fun. We see tech layoffs, cuts to healthcare. We see the government. Even if you got a good government job, do you get a pension anymore? If we made the real world a little bit easier and a little bit kinder, then we wouldn't have these people so desperately trying to escape it, even if that is at the risk of their children, who they're going to train to be influencers.
This has provided pathways for Black voices to be heard and to speak out against injustice. That's the promising aspect of social media in the African-American community, as well as those who are coming from third world countries, the ability to level the playing field and have their narratives shared and their experiences shared.
We think of social media as there being a space for everyone. For Black and brown content creators, is it fair? Is it a fair space to play in?
Short answer is no. There are Black and brown folks who have 500,000 followers to 1 million followers. They're unable to find the monetization pathways to make this actually be sustainable. They're still living at home with their parents. What is the price of visibility? Surveillance is something that comes with visibility. No, it's not necessarily a level playing field.
People really do use social media, but back home in Ethiopia, they usually use Facebook to get news. We've seen Facebook used by users to create polarization when it comes to political issues. So despite its importance in providing news and information to users, it has also been used as a weapon to create two sides within the political sphere, and it had major consequences.
I think for someone that has critical thinking can pinpoint some important aspects that exist in the society. If you are young, you cannot put your critical skills on play. It can be a danger. We create a public opinion that can be used as an instrument. You want to influence the elections.
You're putting yourself out there, which demands visibility, but that also entails considerable vulnerabilities. And there's this kind of like normalization of it. Like, oh, you put yourself out there, so you open yourself up to hate and harassment.
I don't actually know how we protect the children. These platforms legally aren't meant to have anyone under the age of 13 using the apps. And yet we're seeing time and time again that kids who are 6, 7, 8 years old are on the apps, and how easy it is to get around these age gates.
Gen Zers are just receiving news in really unique ways right now. A lot of Gen Zers are actually getting their climate information from TikTok. I really want to make sure that the folks on TikTok and using social media are not being persuaded by disinformation, because there's so much climate disinformation, especially on TikTok.
What surprised you when you started posting?
I was very surprised after seeing the unexpected response that I got from the public. My first video when I was just 6 years old back in 2018 January, I created my first video about a topic which I was not actually familiar with. I've learned that if you want to do something, if you want to bring a change in the society, you should start from yourself, because you are the one who is actually going to bring a change in the society.
Thank you very much for playing this tape. Can we have everybody on the stage now? Because I think we want to have a conversation now of all the 5, 6, 7 of us. Let's see who can all get involved in this. I have a very simple question for each and every one of you. When we look at the last comment, that somebody has done their first video for social media when she was 6 years old. Okay, now you are all very old because you're already 20 and more. Okay, give me your reading of what are the generational, let's say, segments you see. Is there a different generation from 6 to the 10, or is it from 12 to 15, or is it from 15 to 20, and so on? I mean, who has some thoughts about, from your side, as you are growing older, you're looking back now to groups and, let's say, peer groups, generations, which are, let's say, different than you? I'm not saying that you're out of touch with them, but they are different than you. And how would you segment them? Charlotte,
I can jump on that.
Gloria, how would you do that? Please.
Because it's funny that you asked that, because I was working at a university. Now I changed and I'm working with second graders. And working with them, one of the things, like, we use a lot of different digital devices to, the platforms to engage with the youth. And so I remember one of the platforms I thought was still relevant was Facebook. It's really relevant in Tanzania. People still use it, the youth and whatnot. But in Saudi Arabia, Facebook is considered for old people. It's outdated. They're like, oh, only our moms and our dads use that. Like, the current thing that everybody's using is Snapchat and TikTok. And once I started engaging on those platforms, I understood why, what the draw was, why the young people felt that this was a better platform than, say, Facebook, in terms of the way that the interface is. So, one of the terms that they use is influencers. And I was reading that, and they were saying, like, that is becoming an outdated term. And now they want to call them creators, because that's what they're doing. It's easy to create content, and that content to reach a larger population. So, for example, one of the voices over there said, now, in terms of social activism, Black voices, minority voices are being heard without being stifled or regulated, even though to a certain extent it still is being regulated, or it's not really reaching maybe the demographic that they wanted to reach. But compared to where we were before, it's a huge step, but we still have a long way to go, so that when we've been talking about this a lot, that it's not as regulated. But there's definitely a big, I won't say big, but this generational gap in terms of what social media platforms we use, what we still think is relevant, who we engage with in terms of the age groups, and how we use that, and why that engagement is more relevant than, say, Instagram or TikTok versus Facebook and Snapchat.
Okay.
I'd like to add on to that, if that's fine.
Yes, sure. Go ahead, Charlotte, please. Yeah.
So the digital world changes so fast. It's really hard for me, even, and I'm only 21, to keep up with the pace. And I think those fast changes create a huge generational gap, which is why the platforms we use are so different when it only comes to, let's say, 1 or 2 years age difference. And I think it gets to a topic where it's becoming really difficult to raise children, because they're basically being raised by social media and digital platforms. So yeah.
Okay. Give me your reading in terms of the different kind of, let's say, generations. How would you see them now?
I don't think I mean, as Gloria said, you thought Facebook is huge. I don't use Facebook anymore. I don't know how old you are. I'm 21, and Facebook was never an issue for me. I've never really used it. My generation, I think, is really Instagram and Snapchat at the beginning, but I'm growing out of Snapchat right now. And it's the generations below me that are really into Snapchat, but like, as in my cousin, I think she's about 12 now, and she's really into Snapchat. Like, she's obsessed with it. And I remember when she didn't have a phone, she has a phone by now. She would always take my phone and she'd be like, "Oh, can we play on Snapchat? Can we play on Snapchat?" Like, it's something that's considered a game for them and not just a communication platform, I think.
Okay.
I have one thing to add to that.
Yeah.
So, talking about peer groups, there is this phenomenon called peer pressure. I personally do use Snapchat, but I would have never used it if my group of friends also didn't use it. Now, I do have a Facebook account, but I never use it because nobody in my age group is using it. Mm-hmm. Or there's also this aspect that in developing countries, there is limited access to internet, and in the more developed countries, there's a lot of access to it. And the youth in the more developed countries are constantly exposed to these platforms. And that puts a mental pressure on these kids to trying to fit in. Mm-hmm. And these aspects are less relevant in developing countries as the internet is not that accessible. But there's the other issue that they have that the first world countries don't have, which is oppressive governments who try to control everything. As Kingsley mentioned, people try to communicate with emojis instead of text to not get monitored. So as in a world where the technology is rapidly changing, it's up to us to shape the future. And especially, I think it's important to stand in solidarity with our peers in Iran, because these people, despite facing oppression, they have set a standard for the youth worldwide to follow. It's the fact that it is never okay to let those who have no understanding of the impact that their actions have to run the show. And we need to use our voices and use our actions, take actions to create a better and more equitable digital world for all. Thank you.
Sorry, Peter.
No, I just I wanted just to come back to Akshan. One question. Your country of origin is Iran. What do young people in Iran use today?
They are mostly using Instagram.
Instagram, okay.
Instagram is the most popular platform there.
So briefly you and then Kingsley, please.
I'd like to add on to something Arsham just said regarding peer pressure and having to fit in. And I think it's really difficult because there's a very thin line between peer pressure and fitting in and just not existing if you're not on social platforms. If you're not on social platforms nowadays, and if you don't know anything about social platforms, you're basically non-existent.
Okay.
Right.
Kingsley.
Yeah, sure. So my take on everything pretty much, I think it derives slightly from one of the last things that Ashton said, which is, really, so different regions, right? This conversation applies differently because it's very, very well layered, right? So if you're having this conversation with someone in Syria, right, the response will be different because for them, it's being used, the purpose for it is different, right? And that also plays a very big role in the conversation, if you're going to have that. So he talks about developing countries and all that. So that's actually the reality, So whilst there is that layer of it that talks about different demographics and what platforms they are, the affinities they have for different platforms, that is a reality, exists, is real, but also there is a different component to it, which is, why are people using these things in different places? So for example, and Gloria also mentioned that they prefer to be called creators now, right? So if you're Nigeria, for example, where we have, very high unemployment rate, when people see this as an easy access, to sort of earn revenue, right? Then you then see a lot of people gravitating to these platforms, and these technologies just really because they have to. They probably apply for jobs and they didn't get it, or the jobs are just not available. So the use of it also derives from there's a macroeconomic aspect to it. There's a political aspect to it. It's multi-layered really. And that's why when we have these conversations, you want to be able to approach it from diverse angles, pretty much as possible. Most likely it will be impossible to approach it from all the angles that apply, but it's also important that we acknowledge that realities are different across board. And yeah, thank you.
If I see what is the relevance of our conversation for UNESCO and for this global dialogue, what I can see very clearly is how important it is to look at the specific nature of the situation within which you are looking at for guidelines. Okay, so you might have to have guidelines very differently for different kind of age groups, but you might have guidelines also very much differently for various different kind of regions, like Gloria and Kingsley and also Asham said now, very much, in the very specific countries, when you look at the video and how people were talking in the video regarding, making a living, you are making a living because you are sitting in your suburban home and you crave for visibility, and then you want to turn your visibility, monetize it, and then you have this pressure on, in terms of growing this, and the more you grow it, you are vulnerable. and the vulnerability is very much, let's say, a personal vulnerability in terms of your identity. When you are in Lagos or when you're in Tanzania, you're in a completely different situation. You are not looking for visibility in terms of, making a show and selling, new clothes and fashion or shampoo, but you're basically trying to survive and make a living for your material sustenance. Did I understand that correctly? Would you agree with that kind of difference?
Yes and no. Yes and no. To a certain extent. Yes, you can say that there is this in Tanzania or in Africa, or certain regions in Africa, there is still this economic disparity or polarizing economic situation that exists, which kind of does dictate what users use. But if you look at the content creators in Africa and what they create, there's still similarities in that creation and what is being created with the West. So for example, selling dresses or using it for online business. Charlotte brought up a good point, tying that in with your identity. Do I exist if I don't have a social media platform? And it also brings up the question of authenticity as well. Are you authentically really being yourself? Like who we see on social media, is that you versus who we are in real life? And sometimes people get caught up in these, social media creations, but there's such a disconnect with also what's happening within society. So some social media creators use that as an escape. Yes, we're suffering. Yes, we have these issues, but when I get on social media, I can be this whole other, persona that may not really be who I am. So I see that a lot, where somebody puts on this facade of I'm living my best life, but when behind the scenes, that is really not the case. But that's what's being bought and sold.
Okay, thank you. Charlotte, please, yeah.
I'd like to add on something that you just said about people putting on that facade. I think there's also a really thin line here between, like, you have to distinguish between, are they putting on that show because they think they have to be that person, or are they putting on that show because they want to be that person?
Okay. That is definitely a question in terms of what Arshan said before in terms of peer pressure. Kingsley, would you, in terms of the space in which you live and work in Nigeria and in Lagos, how are these, let's say, different aspects of social media? On the one hand, the life making and life, the economic, and sustenance side, and also the other side, the identity side, the, let's say, the social existence side, the group existence side.
Mm-hmm. Right. So for Nigeria, what we find is we've been able to, and maybe because I also work in that space, we've been able to classify different age groups and what platforms apply to them. So for example, people from 45 upwards, 50, upwards, parents, grandparents, mostly gravitate towards WhatsApp and Facebook, right? And then you find the younger people from, maybe say 25 to 35, they do the Instagram and they do Twitter. Facebook is pretty much dead to them. I have a Facebook account, but I pretty much really use that for, the business side of things, and then the younger ones then do Snapchat and TikTok, but again, across all of these demographics, the use of it, particularly the younger generation, is also determined by what their realities are. So like I mentioned, for most people, they do it as it applies across board all over the world. You just need to promote your business. You just need to amplify your market opportunities to really just elevate your chances of survival in the business world, right? For some other people, maybe they're in a much more comfortable space. So for them, it's pretty much just finding community, right? Around the platforms, I don't have friends in real life, but I have friends in the digital space, and then they all just congregate there, right? So there is that, aspect of things. But then there is also, to a large extent, a number of people who are, they've seen how this is. So for example, just like Gloria said, you see people who are flaunting money, cars, or whatever, and they probably tell you, oh, I get this money because I'm a content creator. I get this money because I review cars online, examples, so And then some of these, so for example, if you're able to monetize using Google or Instagram, it's also available to us here, right? And then you don't need, so if you're earning in dollars or foreign currency, and by the time you convert that to a local currency, it can be a lot. So you're not going to be doing that at the scale that people are doing it elsewhere, but you are doing that because it's somewhat easier. The route to market, it's easier, compared to maybe doing some other endeavor, which you're already at a disadvantage because the system here is not encouraging of that. So maybe you've gone to school, you have a degree in engineering, but you really can't get a job in that space. And so you find yourself, it's survival for you. You have your laptop, you have your mobile phone, you have data, and then you start creating content. And of course, I also don't want to present this as somewhat a negative thing. No, because we have young people who are finding creative ways of using this in life. So I'll give an example of someone in the medical space. Is a doctor, went to school, qualified, practice, right? But then he has an Instagram account where he then uses the platform to educate people about, healthcare, how they, and he's adapted that to that ecosystem, of digital media. So he's speaking in a language that you understand. He's introducing the memes and all the things that really attract people, to that space. But his message is really medicine and healthcare. So I think those are the things that we need to promote and also show people that it really, everybody does comment and it's all just like repeated content. It's the same thing everybody is doing, the same script, the same concept across board. But we want to then be able to, because you're not going to be able to roll out the proliferation of digital media. It's here to stay, and it's only going to keep getting, much more in our lives, in our space, because AI is here already. It's not coming. It's here already, right? Everybody, if you're working on a tech project, you also have to be adapting it for the metaverse or artificial intelligence, how that's going to be integrated into your business, right? So I think we need to
what is interesting, what you say also for the UNESCO let's say perspective, is that you're saying each different kind of media platform has also a different kind of language which people then use. So there's a TikTok language, there's an Instagram language, and so on. And then what Ashram said was also the language, and you said also the language changed also according to the social and political circumstances and what you can use. When we look at come back, we have another 10 minutes or 5 minutes for our conversation. When we come back to the issues which you raised yourself regarding accountability and transparency, and then look at these three, let's say, social media worlds. On the one hand, the Facebook world for the old people, then let's say the Instagram and Twitter world for the 20 to 25 people, so it's your generation. And then you have the Snapchat and TikTok for those who are your cousins and possibly your future children, think about this notion of the bias of technology, the bias of a particular kind of social media platform, and relate, in your judgment, what is the bias in terms of transparency or accountability which you see on these different kind of platforms? Let me ask you differently. Do you see that there is a difference between them? And if there's a difference, can you basically say in which way they are different? Gloria, you want to start?
Sure. If I understood it correctly, when you're talking about the biases and maybe in terms of how we engage on the different platforms, is that what you're
the bias, how the technology inflects the way, for instance, you can communicate, and the way this is working because of its transparency and accountability, or non-transparency and non-accountability. Thank you for asking me the question. Yeah.
No problem.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying. So let's take Snapchat, for example. So one of the draws of Snapchat is the fact that there's this disappearing messages. So one of the reasons why users may be here in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, like that, is because if you send a message, it deletes and it doesn't stay on the server. I think after 30 days. So that brings the issue of transparency. So you could have a lot of conversations with different people without it being easily traced or easily tracked. So a lot of users prefer that. So you'll have a lot of different engagements different types of engagements on Snapchat versus if I'm talking on Instagram or Facebook. How I use that, I may not be as transparent. I may not be as open because there is always this idea or this notion in the back of my mind, this can be taken out of my platform and publicized or be put out there. So when you talk about transparency, you also have to look at why are we using that platform in the first place? Are we using it for just social discourse? Are we using it for political discourse? And if it's for political discourse, then there's certain platforms such as, like, for example, Telegram, that appeal to a certain demographic or a certain group of people because they know that they're safer on that platform. It's easier for them to communicate. There are tools and resources that have adapted to allow them to engage in a way where they feel like what I say won't be used against me. I have still that aura of anonymity, which I won't have on a platform like Facebook or a platform like Instagram or TikTok, which is main streamline of creation is the fact that it's meant for the public. It's meant to be transparent. It's meant to hold people accountable because you will know where it came from and you can trace that back to whoever uses it.
Thank you very much.
I have something to add to that.
Yes, please. Okay,
sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. So a very good question. Gloria asked, why are we using these platforms when we know that they are promoting fake identities and false behavior? It reminded me of a quote from a very famous movie. I haven't watched the movie yet, but the quote went viral. It says, "We buy things we don't need with the money we don't have to impress the people we don't like." It's the movie Fight Club. And the thing is, I think it's human nature. We all try to make ourselves look better than we are. But there is a social media platform called Be Real. Have you ever heard of it? Anyone here? So Be Real is this platform where every couple of hours, every 5 hours, I guess, you get to post one picture a day or 2 pictures a day every 5 hours. And you take a picture from the front camera and the back camera at the same time. And that's the only way that you can communicate through the app, which brings back the authenticity. It makes the people be real. That's why the app is called Be Real. So I think when a 6-year-old child starts posting stuff on Instagram, they are not really aware of what the consequences are and the rabbit hole that they can get caught into. And there needs to be education before these children needs to be they need to be aware of the consequences when they are using these platforms. But I also think that the older generation also needs to be aware of it, because they are, let's say, they are the people who are, I mean, look at the UNESCO delegates. None of them were using TikTok. When I asked them how many of you are using TikTok, a couple of people just raised their hands. And I said, for example, oh, you guys have the dinosaur mindset, because this in the digital era, the youth have now turned the tables around, and now they are using all the social media platforms. But the people who are trying to regulate it are so far away from the reality of the social media, they can't really even imagine how it's really like on a day-to-day basis to be exposed to these things. So my idea is that there can't just be education among the youth. That is needed, but there needs to be exchange on an expert level among the dinosaurs, among the experts, the practitioners, the stakeholders, on all these different sectors and the regions of the Jurassic world, and these perspectives and the experiences of the young people themselves needs to be included. I mean, look at the interview that we had yesterday. One day before that, we got a list of questions we needed to answer. And these are the most generic questions I've ever read. I mean, the answer is either super obvious or nobody can answer them. And everything is on an abstract level. They don't even know which questions they need to ask the youth to get the right information, to get the right perspectives. And I think our host did a really great job to do a balance, to actually get the real perspective out of us. But I think UNESCO needs to host these sessions with youth moderators, someone from the age group that also understands the dynamic, who can also ask the right questions to bring out the most amount of value and put it on the table.
Does this apply also to this kind of webinars?
It depends. It depends. We are taking the multi-stakeholder approach to this. We need all the angles.
Yeah.
Both of them are, that's my point. Both of them are just as important.
Okay.
Well, Peter, I think you have an honorary
Kingsley.
membership to our demography.
Yeah. Thank you. You're
Yeah.
lovely.
Yeah.
Give me Kingsley, give me your reading on the bias of the platforms regarding transparency.
I think, you know, it works both ways, right? What Gloria said is applicable, but you also have to understand what is the motivation for the platforms themselves. Every platform you have right now is on a race to become this super app, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why you see a lot of, you know, they're all adapting features from one another, because it's a race to who gets there first. Because think about it, there's also immediate what we call saturation, right? Consumer saturation, which is I only can be on so many platforms at the same time consuming different content. So, and these platforms know this, you know, and as much as I'm aware of TikTok, BeReal, all of these new platforms, I really can't be on them because, you know, I'm used to my Instagram and my Twitter. So I might, you know, have access to them for business, you know, reasons. But in terms of my everyday use, I'm really just going to be limited because I'm busy. I have my real life to attend to. So I'm only just going to be, you know, so naturally they would either bias the technology, bias, you know, the platform itself to meet their business objective, which is to get as many people abandon other platforms and come to their own platform, which is why Facebook is buying up everybody, you know, buying WhatsApp, buying Instagram, and then, you know, unless you're so big that they can't purchase you, they will just acquire you, you know, along the way. So what that also does is, you know, coming from what Gloria said, people themselves. So for example, locally, Twitter is known for politics. You know, Facebook is for propaganda, right? And so the people, you know, my colleagues who work in this space would know how you would layer your strategies so that it aligns. So for example, if I know that parents for my age group gravitate more or congregate more on Facebook, I would push propaganda there because it's going to get to me. So if my parents go on Facebook and then they see the propaganda that's been, you know, propagated on Facebook, and they come home and have a conversation with me, I'm going to, you know, circulate that on Twitter, you know, which is the platform that I also have like a lot more of my folks gathering there. So they're not going to come to bother me on Twitter. They will go on Facebook and pump a lot of that propaganda there because they know ultimately it's going to come back to me. You know, so all of these are things that when we talk about regulation or transparency, we need to be able to have these conversations. And the people who are going to be able to have these conversations in the way that is going to yield positive results, it really comes back to what we've been talking about, which is representation. You know, young people are the ones who are going to be able to properly, you know, create the tools or the mechanisms for transparency and ensure that everyone is held accountable. If you don't know how, you know, the mechanics behind, so for example, if China, I think it was really around the Hong Kong protest, if they didn't know, or if they don't know how this is happening, how are you going to be able to, you know, guard against people, you know, with bad intent? So for example, terrorists also using that for their own agenda, because almost everything can be co-opted for, you know, some, you know, other intention, right? So it comes back to the one singular point that we mentioned, everyone, Charlotte, Ashram have said here, which is young people need to be carried along more than we've been carried along so far.
I think what you're pointing to is very much also a very good conclusion for our conversation this morning. This conversation takes place as a reflection on this Internet4Trust conference, where the objective is to define information as public good, but what you did is now you did something very different, or let's say you surpassed this. You said the information space, the social media space, is actually the space in which we live, in which we exist, where we form our identity, where we are actually also doing our business and do our livelihood. And therefore, we need to basically think about this social media space, this internet space, in terms of how do we want to structure our world? How do we want to govern this world? How do we want to regulate, manage this world? How do we want to make this world to be responsive to us, accountable, transparent, and also, a way in which we can use it participatory? Charlotte said at the very beginning, realize through this process that the question of how this world is shaped is actually an issue which people have taken up, the regulatory agencies and the governments and also the UNESCO's. But what you said, Kingsley, is there's also, it's shaped by this race of the platforms, to have their billion users, their 2 billion users, because they make money, they are profitable on the basis of the advertising revenues they gather from the attention they can control or they can hold. Within the UNESCO, there is a number of different kind of, let's say, initiatives and programs. And one of those initiatives and programs is a program called Information for All. IFAP is that program. And we are privileged to have the chair of that program, Dorothy Gordon from Ghana, as part, and she has been listening in to not just this conversation, but also over the last 2 days, having been very, very active on this. She is also a member of the board of directors of the World Summit Awards, and she is one of my most beloved personal critics. Mrs. Gordon, are you here? I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
We lovely can hear you. We have talked previously that you would share with us your reflections on this conversation and sum it up from your side, because you are basically having 4 hats. You have a very strong hat as a woman activist globally. You are very strong in terms of being an African, also internationally. You are very much astute in terms of the United Nations system, and you know how this various different kind of things, and you love the WSA network. So 4 qualifications, great.
Yeah, I just want to congratulate your panelists. It's been a wonderful discussion. And what I am getting out of this discussion in terms of things that we can do immediately is, first of all, we do have to make those multi-stakeholder dialogues real. Thank you for reminding us that it's not just turning up at the conversation. You have to have the education behind it to understand how to engage with the conversation. And I think this is really important, given that we are talking about very different geographies. And the panel reminded us of the differences in use, influencing versus survival, different platforms that are being used. And those platforms, even though I could say that in general, all platforms are really interested in collecting your data, which they can then use to profile and then market, they do it in different ways and they have different regulations and rules. And we have to start from that point where we have a deeper understanding of how these platforms are actually working when we use them. I remember Charlotte telling us that she hadn't even thought about it. She thought it was part of real life, natural life, to use these things without thinking about what goes on behind. And, I speak a lot on this issue because it's all to do with surveillance capitalism. And it's a new form of oppression And many young people don't realize what is really happening. I didn't hear enough about data in the conversation. And I also didn't hear enough about behavior modification, because that is also very much part of platform life today, in that they're using very discrete techniques from cognitive psychology to actually change people's minds and change your opinion of who you are and what you need. And this is what is impacting a lot on mental health. So I think that what you've said here today is reminding us that we need to do that education within the ranks of young people. But perhaps even more importantly, we need to do far more education with the dinosaurs like myself, and Peter is a senior dinosaur to me. So we need to have more education among the dinosaurs so that we actually understand what is happening on social media, and we're not discussing it in abstract. You know, I think from the session that we had yesterday, I really liked Asham's approach. You didn't talk enough about it today because you're deeply involved in peer mentoring, and you were able to bring about, from what you said, you were able to bring about that change in mindset among people who were gradually becoming polarized and very aggressive through peer mentoring and building that understanding of what their virtual life meant for their real life. You were able to bring about change. So I think that even as we talk about education, let us emphasize a lot more on peer mentoring. Let us emphasize a lot on understanding policy. And if I can mention one thing, Peter, as you said, I'm your great critic. And what I like about you is when I criticize, you take it on board and we do something new. What I realize is that the young people we've been talking to today are from a particular strata of society. You know, either they're based in the global north, or if they're from the global south, they're among those people who have ready access. We need to probe a little below to look at the people who go online. Like when I go to the village, I see all the kids gathered around one phone, happily viewing pornographic content. We need to go to that level where people are using shared devices and figure out how are we going to get them engaged in this conversation, and how are we going to make it matter to the platforms. Because as your panelists, you know, said, the motivation of the platforms differs. Their bottom line is their bottom line, but how they go about it is different in different geographies and for different target groups. So I was very impressed because I think that it's opening up for us as the WSA that we need to have far more of these dialogues with young people. And then also, we need to do the education among our network. And we have such a strong network of innovators, because that's the last point that I would end on, is that we're dependent on all of these platforms. Many of them are not being created within our territories. What happened to all those indigenous networks that we used to have? Nigeria used to have active national networks. They all died due to power of other big networks. Do we need to do a bit more innovation? And yesterday during the meeting, people reminded us that there are small companies that are already innovating actively and just need APIs that could help us to overcome some of the negatives and build on the positives. And thank you so much to your panelists for reminding us that this is a livelihood issue. It is a national security issue. It is a mental health issue. It's an entertainment issue. It is multifaceted. It is complex. Nobody has all the answers. We have to listen to each other and figure a way ahead. Thank you so much. And I look forward as chair of IFAP to actually supporting you to hold those dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy Gordon. You are calling in from Ghana, from Accra. And thank you very much for your perspective and also for concluding our webinar on the Internet4Trust, the UNESCO conference, global conference towards guidelines for regulating digital platforms for information as a public good. I'm the chairman of the World Summit Awards. I work together with Nora Woloch and her team. Nora is the executive manager here. I want to thank her and Katharina Weber for all the work they have done to make this possible this morning. I want to thank also Guilherme and his team at UNESCO. And we have done a recording of this session, and we will exploit this session and carry it on. Thank you very much, especially also to Charlotte and Aksham for coming to Paris and taking 3 days of their lives, professional lives, personal lives, entertainment lives. And also thank you very much, Gloria and Kingsley, for joining us from Africa or from the Arab countries. Talk to you soon. Thank you very much. Keep connected, stay connected, connect for social impact. Thank you.